The afternoon sun was beginning to fade when John Harris parked his old pickup truck outside a small diner on the corner of Maple Street. He had driven through this town many times before but had never stopped here. The sign above the door said, "Sonny's Diner, home of the best coffee in town." It looked warm and welcoming from the outside. Through the window he could see families talking, laughter filling the air and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the open door. John smiled to himself. After a long drive from visiting an old friend at the veterans' home, a quiet meal seemed like the perfect way to end the day. John was in his late 60s now. His back wasn't as straight as it used to be, and his steps had slowed over the years, but his eyes still carried that same steady calmness that once led younger soldiers through the toughest days. He wore a faded green jacket, one he had kept since his service years. The small patch on his shoulder still showed the unit emblem, though time had worn away some of its color. He didn't wear it to draw attention, only because it reminded him of where he came from. As he walked in, the sound of conversation lowered slightly. The diner was busy, but not too crowded. A young waitress smiled kindly from one corner, but before she could greet him, the new manager, a man in his early 40s, stepped forward from behind the counter. His name tag read, "Rick, can I help you?" Rick asked, his tone polite but cold. John smiled. "Just a seat, son. Been on the road for a while. Could use a cup of coffee and maybe some soup." Rick's eyes moved from John's face down to his jacket, and something in his expression changed. He frowned slightly and looked around the diner. "Sorry, sir," he said flatly. "We're full right now. Maybe come back later." John glanced around. There were several empty tables, one right by the window. "Looks like you've got a few open spots," he said softly, not accusingly, just observing. Rick crossed his arms. "Those are reserved. We're short on staff today." For a moment, John thought about arguing. He could tell from the way Rick spoke that this wasn't about tables or staff. It was about judgment. The way some people looked at older veterans thinking they were just tired old men holding on to memories. But John wasn't the arguing type. He had faced far worse than a cold shoulder in a small diner. He nodded slowly. "All right then. I understand." As he turned to leave, a few customers looked away awkwardly. One older lady whispered something to her husband. The young waitress by the corner looked guilty but didn't say a word. John walked outside, the small bell above the door ringing behind him as it closed. The air outside felt colder now. He walked to a wooden bench near the parking lot and sat down, stretching his sore legs. Across the street, a child waved a tiny flag, probably from a recent school event, and John smiled faintly. It reminded him of the parades he used to march in, back when the town gathered to cheer for soldiers returning home. Those days felt far away now. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It showed his unit, 20 men standing in front of a dusty Humvee somewhere overseas. They were smiling, arms around each other, covered in sweat and dust. John's eyes softened as he traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. Half of the men in that picture were now scattered across the country. A few had already passed on. They had all shared the same oath, to serve, to protect, and to look out for one another. He took a deep breath and watched the sunset over the rooftops. He didn't feel angry, just a little sad. Not for himself, but for how easily people forgot. Once, the uniform meant honor and courage. Now some just saw an old man with worn boots and a jacket full of memories. After a few minutes, the waitress from inside stepped out. She carried a small paper cup and a brown bag. "Sir," she said quietly, "I made some extra coffee. Thought you might like it." John smiled warmly. "That's kind of you, miss." "You didn't have to do that." She shook her head. "You served our country. It's the least I can do." He accepted it with gratitude. The warmth of the cup felt comforting against his rough hands. "Thank you," he said sincerely. As she went back inside, John leaned back and took a slow sip. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, but to him it tasted perfect. He sat there for a long time, listening to the distant sounds of traffic, the laughter from inside the diner, and the soft rustling of leaves. He wasn't someone who sought pity. His heart was calm even after the insult. Life had taught him patience. But what he didn't know was that someone in that diner had recognized him, a young man sitting near the counter who had seen John's face before on the wall of the local Veterans Hall. That man took a picture of John through the window, sitting alone with his coffee, and later shared it on social media with a short caption. This man served our country. He was just denied service in our town. By the time John finished his coffee and started his truck, that photo had already begun to spread online. Old friends from his unit would soon see it. They would remember the man who had led them through sandstorms, hunger, and fear, the man who never left anyone behind. But John didn't know any of that yet. He simply drove away quietly, the headlights cutting through the early evening mist. Inside the cab, the radio played an old country song about home and honor. He hummed along softly, unaware that his quiet dignity was about to awaken something powerful, something that would bring his brothers and sisters in uniform back together again. That night, while the town slept, the story of one old soldier sitting alone outside a diner started to touch hearts far beyond that small corner of Maple Street. It was only the beginning of something much bigger, a moment that would remind everyone that true respect is not about words or medals. It is about remembering the people who gave their best so others could live freely, and for John Harris, that reminder was on its way, carried not by anger or pride, but by loyalty and love that never fades. The next morning, miles away from the small-town diner, a man named Corporal Daniel Davis sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He wasn't expecting anything unusual that day, but one photo stopped him cold. It was a picture of an older man sitting on a bench outside a diner, holding a paper cup, with a tired but peaceful look on his face. The caption underneath read, "Retired soldier denied service today. He just wanted a cup of coffee." Davis felt his chest tighten as he looked closer. Even after all these years, he could recognize that face anywhere. "Sergeant Harris," he whispered. He quickly put his mug down and stared at the screen again to make sure it was really him. There was no mistake. That calm expression, the strong jawline, the same faded jacket with the old unit patch. That was his old commanding officer, the man who had led their team through countless hard days. Memories rushed back all at once. Davis remembered the long marches, the blistering heat, and how Harris always carried the heavier load so his younger soldiers could rest. He remembered a night when they were surrounded, and Harris refused to leave until everyone made it to safety. He had always been more than a leader. He was a protector, a man who cared for his team like family. Now, seeing him treated so poorly hurt deeply. Davis couldn't believe that the same man who once commanded respect on the battlefield was now sitting alone outside a diner, ignored by people who didn't even know his story. Without a second thought, Davis grabbed his phone and started calling his old friends from the unit. The first call was to Jackson, their medic. "You seen the photo?" Davis asked. Jackson sighed heavily. "Yeah, just this morning. That's Harris, isn't it?" "It's him," Davis confirmed. "We can't just sit and let this slide. That man's done too much for all of us." Within hours, the old unit's group chat came alive. Messages poured in from all corners of the country. There was Carla, who had moved to Texas after retiring, Sam, who now worked as a firefighter, and even Malik, who hadn't spoken much since leaving the service but responded almost instantly. Everyone had the same reaction: disbelief, anger, and a deep sense of loyalty. They all remembered the man who once stood between them and danger. No one forgot how he'd risked his life to pull Malik out of a burning vehicle, or how he'd quietly paid for Carla's ticket home when her mother passed away. Sergeant John Harris had never once turned his back on them, and now not one of them was willing to turn their back on him. That evening, Davis proposed a plan. "We don't start a fight," he said. "We just remind people who he is and what respect looks like." Everyone agreed. They decided to meet the next morning right there in front of Sonny's diner. They would come in full uniform, medals, ribbons, everything, not to intimidate anyone, but to stand together, as they had always done. Early, the next morning, the town was still quiet when the first cars began to pull up along Maple Street. One by one, the veterans stepped out. The sight was powerful. There was Carla in her sharp blue Air Force uniform, her hair neatly tied back. Jackson wore his army greens, polished shoes gleaming. Davis adjusted his cap, his chest full of pride and emotion. They hadn't all been together in years. Yet standing side by side again felt natural, almost like time had rewound. As the group gathered, locals began to notice. People paused on the sidewalks, whispering and pointing. The veterans didn't say much. They just stood tall, waiting for everyone to arrive. By the time John Harris's old pickup appeared at the corner, nearly 15 veterans were there, all members of his former unit, some even driving from neighboring states overnight just to be there. When John stepped out of the truck, his eyes widened in surprise. He looked around at the familiar faces, men and women he hadn't seen in years. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. His throat tightened with emotion. "Morning, Sergeant," Davis said, walking up with a small smile. "We heard you couldn't get your coffee yesterday. Thought we'd join you today." John chuckled softly, still stunned. "You all came for this?" Carla stepped forward. "For you, sir. Always for you." The group fell into formation without anyone giving an order. Old habits never died. Together, they walked toward the diner, their boots striking the pavement in steady rhythm. The sound was unmistakable, disciplined, united, and full of quiet power. Inside the diner, customers turned to stare as the door opened. The same manager, Rick, looked up from the counter. His face turned pale as he saw the group marching in. Davis approached the counter calmly. "We'd like a table for 16, he said evenly. Rick stammered. Of course, sir. Right away." He hurried to arrange the tables, his earlier confidence gone. The veterans took their seats with John sitting in the middle. The waitress from the day before smiled when she saw him. "Good to see you again, sir," she said warmly. John nodded politely. "Thank you. It's good to be back." The air inside felt different now, respectful, almost reverent. Other customers whispered quietly. Some even stood to shake hands with the veterans. The tension that had filled the place before was gone, replaced by admiration. When their meals arrived, no one said much at first. They just ate together, like old times. The laughter returned slowly. Stories began to flow. Stories about their days overseas, the small jokes they used to share, the moments that kept them going when times were hard. Rick finally walked over, his face full of regret. "Sir," he said to John, "I owe you an apology. I didn't realize who you were, and that was wrong of me." John looked at him kindly. "You don't need to know who I am to show respect," he said softly. "Every person deserves kindness. That's all." Rick nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "You're right," he managed. "I'll remember that." By the time they finished their meals, the entire diner had watched something special, a quiet reminder of what true respect means. The veterans stood up together, leaving generous tips for the staff. Before they left, a group photo was taken, John in the middle, surrounded by his unit, everyone smiling proudly. As they walked out into the sunlight, people from nearby shops came outside to applaud. John was humbled but grateful. He never wanted attention or praise, only to feel that same sense of belonging he had always cherished among his brothers and sisters in service. What started as one man's quiet humiliation had turned into a powerful moment of unity. A simple act that reminded everyone that dignity doesn't fade with time, and gratitude is something we owe to those who gave their best for others. John looked at his old team, eyes glistening. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly. Davis smiled. "You taught us never to leave anyone behind, remember?" John nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "That's right," he said, "and I guess I never will be." The group laughed gently as they walked toward their cars side by side once more, their loyalty unbroken, their respect unshaken, and their hearts full of pride that needed no words. The morning after the diner visit, the small town of Maple Street was buzzing with talk. People who had seen the veterans walk in together couldn't stop sharing what they witnessed. Pictures of John Harris sitting proudly among his old unit were spreading across social media. One caption read, "They stood with their brother today, the man who once stood for them." Within hours, the post was shared thousands of times. What had started as a small act of loyalty between soldiers was now touching hearts across the country. John didn't know how much attention the story had gained. He wasn't active online and didn't care much for fame. He had lived long enough to know that respect meant more when it came quietly. That morning, he was back at his small house at the edge of town, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee. The air was fresh, birds were chirping, and the rising sun warmed his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt a peaceful heaviness in his heart, the kind that comes after something meaningful. He thought about what his friends had done. They had driven from miles away, left work, families, and busy lives, all to stand beside him. He had not asked for it, but their loyalty reminded him that the bond they shared was still strong. Decades had passed since their service days, yet one thing remained the same. They still looked out for each other. A car pulled up near his house. It was Davis. He stepped out holding a newspaper in his hand, grinning. "Morning, Sergeant," he called out. John smiled and stood. "Morning, Corporal. You're up early." "You're on the front page," Davis said, handing him the paper. The headline read, "Veterans Reunite to Honor One of Their Own." Beneath it was a photo of John sitting at the diner, surrounded by his team. John shook his head with a chuckle. "I didn't expect all this. Neither did we," Davis said. "But people needed to see it. They needed a reminder." John looked at the photo quietly. "Maybe you're right. The world could use a little more kindness." That afternoon, something extraordinary happened. The owner of Sonny's Diner, a woman named Lisa, called John personally. She wasn't there the day of the incident, and when she found out what had happened, she felt deeply sorry. She invited John and his friends back for a meal, her treat. She also announced that the diner would now give all veterans a permanent discount, not as charity, but as a thank you for their service. When John told Davis and the others about it, they agreed to go, not for attention, but to accept the gesture in goodwill. A few days later, they returned to the diner, this time welcomed warmly. The same manager, Rick, met them at the door, looking humble and sincere. "I was wrong," he said to John, his voice low but steady. "I judged before I understood. I've learned something I'll never forget." John nodded, his tone gentle. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." That simple reply touched everyone present. Even the customers who had witnessed the earlier incident came over to greet John and his friends. The atmosphere in the diner had changed completely. Laughter filled the air, the smell of coffee mixed with the sound of friendly chatter, and for once, everyone seemed connected by something greater than themselves: respect. After the meal, Lisa asked if she could hang the photo of John and his unit on the diner wall. "I want people to remember this," she said, "so they never forget the meaning of gratitude." John agreed, a small smile on his face. "Then hang it high," he said, "so the next generation can see that service never really ends." The photo went up that same evening, framed neatly with a small brass plate below it that read, "In honor of those who serve and those who stand by them." It became a symbol of pride for the town. Visitors who came to eat would often stop by the photo, read the story printed beside it, and leave with a quiet sense of respect. But for John, the best part wasn't the recognition. It was the moments he shared afterward with his old friends. They started meeting once a month at the diner, sitting at the same table, sharing stories, laughter, and memories. Some brought their children, introducing them to the team that never broke apart. The bond among them grew even stronger. They helped each other with small things, fixing roofs, mowing lawns, or simply being there to talk when life felt heavy. What had started as one man's painful experience turned into a reunion of hearts, a reminder of friendship, loyalty, and how one small act of unity can bring light where there was once sadness. As months passed, John noticed more veterans coming to the diner. Some were young, just back from service. Others were older, walking with canes but smiling when they saw the picture on the wall. The diner became a meeting place, a quiet symbol of gratitude and togetherness. One evening, as John sat with his unit watching the sunset through the diner window, a young man in uniform walked up. He looked nervous but determined. "Sir," he said to John, "I just wanted to thank you. I saw your story online. It reminded me why I joined the Army, to serve with honor just like you did." John felt a lump in his throat. He reached out and shook the young man's hand firmly. "Keep that heart, son," he said. "It'll guide you when things get tough." The young soldier nodded, saluted respectfully, and left. The table fell quiet for a moment. Then Carla smiled softly. "You see, Sergeant? You're still leading even now." John laughed gently. "Maybe so," he said. "But this time I've got a whole town standing beside me." Outside, the last rays of the sun painted the street golden. People were walking their dogs, children were playing, and laughter echoed from nearby shops. Life felt peaceful again, simple, honest, and good. As John finished his coffee, he looked at his reflection in the window. He saw not just an old soldier, but a man surrounded by love, loyalty, and respect. He realized something important that day, that true honor isn't given by medals or words. It's built by the lives we touch, the kindness we show, and the values we carry even when no one is watching. When he stood up to leave, he glanced one last time at the framed photo on the wall. His younger self smiled back at him through that image, surrounded by the same faces who still stood with him today. It wasn't just a picture anymore. It was a story of unity, a lesson for everyone who saw it. And as John stepped outside, he whispered quietly to himself, "Once a soldier, always a soldier." The wind carried his words softly down the street, as the lights of the diner glowed behind him, a small, shining reminder that kindness and respect never go out of service.